Good day, everyone. I'm Mark Roach with Sun Life Canada. My pronouns are he and him. Welcome to the Active Allyship and Empowerment Indigenous Perspectives Western Canada's Dive-In event for 2021. I'm the event manager and host, and so today's event is going to be a fireside chat with our panelists who will share their perspectives as leaders in the Indigenous communities. We're delighted to have you join us today. Before introducing our speakers and our moderator, what I'd like to do is, and we will have a land acknowledgement with that as well. What I'd like to do is just thank our 22 uh, global festival partners and that you saw highlighted in the video, and our Western event sponsors as well that are shown on the screen. And we appreciate the financial support. And I also want to comment that we've had 30 planning committee members as well who produced today's event. So big thank you to them. Dive-In is a result of collaboration across the insurance industry. The success of Dive-In relies on hundreds of volunteers globally who find time to organize the events while tending to their work and family obligations. So I'd like to extend a huge thank you to them for their dedication and congratulate them for creating a festival full of informative, inspiring discussions. Personally, what drew me to this topic was the reality of our collective obligation to do more in acknowledging our Indigenous communities and their lands on which we live and thrive. What I hope you will take away from this session is a few actions to take individually and organizationally to acknowledge the truth and begin to contribute to reconciliation. This session is being recorded and the slides will be made available. We will break to answer questions about 15 to 20 minutes before the close of the session. So encourage you to submit your questions throughout. And there is the ability to submit those in the chat. Now, I am delighted to introduce our moderator. Leading today's fireside chat is Michelle Robinson. Michelle fulfills many roles as a facilitator for mending broken hearts, healing unresolved grief through the White Bison Wellbriety Training Institute. She is a volunteer on the Calgary Police Service Indigenous Justice Committee. She's a volunteer for Indigenous Liaison 12 Community Safety Initiative that runs the only open to the public Indigenous book club, Chapters and Chat, for over 5 years. Michelle is a co-chair of the Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women, Girls, and Two-Spirit Calgary Committee. She's assistant producer for Calgary Animated Object Society, or CHAOS, founded to encourage youth to continue with post-secondary education through opening a registered education savings plan and encouraging folks with low income to utilize the Canada Learning Bond. Michelle is also a co-founder of Voices, a group advocating for the Two-Spirit and queer community, queer people of color in Calgary. And she is Calgary Chair for Indigenous Peoples Commission in Alberta. Michelle was the first First Nation person to run for City Council in Calgary. She ran as well as the candidate for the Alberta Liberal Party for Calgary East in April 2019. She is co-founder of Sovereign Spirits, an Indigenous nonprofit for Two-Spirit, IndigiQueer, and LGBTQ2IA+. Michelle is a proud mom and has volunteered in her daughter's activities and now homeschools. Michelle also has a podcast called Native Calgarian, which is in its 4th year. Welcome to you, Michelle.
Well, I'm really honored to be here. Thank you for that wonderful introduction, Mark. I appreciate it. So my understanding is that there are people from all over the globe that are here. And just to give some context about a land acknowledgement, we do this because when Britain and France decided to come to Canada and create what is now Canada, what they did was they decided to not recognize the hundreds of millions of Indigenous peoples that were here prior to that colonization. And as a result, we've undergone genocide and continue to undergo genocide. So what we do, rather than recognizing Canada, is recognizing the land that we are actually speaking from, because it was never properly recognized in Western context, and that needs to be understood by folks globally, that they have an important role in colonialism. So this land acknowledgement that we do here in Canada, is something that is new. I'm sure internationally you've heard of the unmarked graves that have happened. This was the genocide that was perpetrated on our people. So we recognize the over 600 nations that are just in Canada alone, not including the ones that are in the States, that has the exact same history, unfortunately, from both Britain and France and those who came across. So right here where we're all from is Calgary, Alberta, Canada, where a lot of you would be understanding this coming from. But here we call it Mokinstis, and we point to our elbow. And that's just in one language of the Blackfoot. But here we have many different languages. In my language, it would be called Clincho Tine Indahe, meant after this Calgary Stampede, many Horsetown. So I want to start by doing a full land acknowledgement. I'm also going to speak a little bit in Blackfoot to acknowledge my language. The language that we're on, the language that we've been taught, my spirit name. These are things that have become our custom in this area. So Oki, Naganago, Meko Che, Stokom Aki. My name is Michelle Robinson. My spirit name is Red Thunder Woman. I use she and her pronouns. I want to start by acknowledging the land that we're on. Right now we're in Calgary. I happen to be in Lethbridge, but all of this is a part of what's called the Blackfoot Confederacy. The US-Canadian border split up the Blackfoot Confederacy. So south of the border in the States is the Blackfeet Nation. North of the border are the Ganai, Siksika, and Bagani of the Confederacy. Yesterday was actually the 144th anniversary of the treaty that was signed, that the Indigenous nations made with the Crown. And with that, we acknowledge the Blackfoot Confederacy, but also the Stoney Nakoda, the Wesley Chiniki Bearspaw Nations, as well as the Dene from Tsuut'ina. I always acknowledge all First Nation, Métis, Inuit status and non-status across Turtle Island as the caretakers of this area. We wouldn't have all the resources that the rest of the world gets to exploit if it wasn't for all of these Indigenous nations taking care of this land. This land here that we have, unfortunately, because of awful government policies invented by Britain and France on our people, we now are undergoing genocide, and a lot of our people don't even know their own nation that they came from because of child apprehension policies that have been imposed on our people. So a lot of folks know their First Nation. Maybe they know their Métis or Inuit, but they actually don't know their language and they don't know their territory because they were stolen at birth by the RCMP, child welfare, or the doctors and nurses that came from Britain to impose their Western economy and ways and customs on our people. So these land acknowledgements are really critical for creating a safer space for Indigenous people. It honors the treaties in a way that's never been done before, and unfortunately, Canada purposely has excluded this education from the Canadian system and Western education in order to feel good about colonialism, capitalization, or colonialism and capitalism on our people. So this is the point of acknowledging the land, and I encourage, if you're from Canada, that you learn where you're from. Are you part of a number of treaties? Are you part of the post or modern day treaties? And to acknowledge what your role in settler colonial status is. So, you know, when you introduce yourself, to introduce who you are. So I'm Satu Dene. I was born in Calgary, or Mokinstis, and I'm proud to talk about Indigenous issues on my podcast. And what I encourage settlers to do is learn your lineage and introduce yourself to people in a good way. So with that, what I'm going to do is I'm going to ask Deborah to introduce herself so that you can hear how she introduces her ways too.
Hi. Thank you, Michelle, for the land acknowledgement in your opening remarks. You all speak from a place of truth, and I honor you for that. So, Tonse, Kagiga, Manitogan, Iskyu, Nihiao, Kwakatu's First Nation. Hello, my name is Forever Spirit Woman. I'm a Cree girl from Kwaktus First Nation in Saskatchewan. My English colonial name is Deborah Green, and I've made my home in Mohkinstsis for many years now, so I'm really honored to be here today. Thank you.
Happy. Kimberly, would you like to introduce yourself in your way?
I would. Miigwech. Amin, Bojo, Bejik Pinesikwe, Nindigenikas, Migazi Dudem, Gawekwe Dawangak, Nendunji, Shago, Winnipeg, Nendunji. And I just introduced myself in my traditional way. I'm Lone Thunderbird Woman. I'm from the Eagle Clan. And I place mark for you, just tying it back to Michelle's very wonderful teaching on land acknowledgements. The significance of place marking, my birthright, my ancestral lands is the west shore of Lake Manitoba. And I also live in Winnipeg. I'm also known as Kimberly Levasseur Puhatch. I'm the daughter of an Indian residential school survivor, along with a family member to many others. I'm a wife, I'm a mother, I'm an active community volunteer. I'm passionate about this work, about social justice overall, but specifically Indigenous social justice. I'm so honored and proud to be here representing Gallagher. I'm the associate, vice president for people and culture for the West in Canada. And I just want to honor my panelists and Michelle, you as the moderator, you're incredible female warriors. And I'm so looking forward to cozying up by the ishkode, the fire. I'm warming my hands, representing warmth and safety. And I know that the fire that is burning figuratively behind us, around us, is going to create a space for us to connect, to communicate, and share safely, warmly, and openly. Miigwech.
Wonderful. I want to say thank you to you both so much for those kind words, and I'm just honored to be here with both of you, and I'm honored to be here with Anna Marie as well. And Anna, would you like to, Anne Marie, would you like to introduce yourself in your way?
Thank you, Michelle. You know what? My family all calls me Anna, so feel free. Aboshted, Oki, Tanse, and good day, everyone. And I wanted to welcome in my languages of these wonderful, beautiful Indigenous sisters that we sit here today, and we have the opportunity to gather and to speak about how passionate we are about this topic today, and to move forward in the reconciliation journey. So I'm originally from the Alexis Nakota Sioux Nation in Treaty 6 territory. I was adopted out of my community, and so I came back as a young woman and met with my family, and I've had the opportunity. I say that I tell people that I won the lottery because I had a very great adoptive home that cared and loved me and accepted everything that where I'm from. So with that, Ishnish, and thank you.
Oh, everyone here is like, I wish people understood how important it is for Indigenous folks to be able to just sit and chat with each other like this. And I'm really grateful for this opportunity for us as a panel discussion to talk about, roadblocks that there are faced by Indigenous people, and moving forward to try to encourage business, the insurance industry to move forward on what we call reconciliation. So this was organized with some really wonderful, talented volunteers in the back, and I wanted to thank them all for trying to make this a wonderful, inclusive, opening space. And we're just going to kind of go over some topics about business and reconciliation. And a lot of folks may not know we're having these conversations in Canada about truth and reconciliation because our elders spoke of their experiences that had happened in Indian residential schools, a policy that was imposed on our people. We did not agree to the genocide that was actually perpetrated by these Indian residential schools. And it just as a statistical fact, it was actually safer to go to World War II than it was to have our children go to Indian residential schools. And Canada has worked very hard at covering up these truths. And so as a country, we are working now at trying to rebuild a relationship with each other. And I hope that folks see their role in this. But business plays a huge component of this. Call to Action 92 is actually on business and reconciliation. And the resources from the Truth and Reconciliation Commission report are free and available. So there's a summary of Call to Action 92, but there's also a more in-depth conversation about it. Also, with the Truth and Reconciliation Commission report, we had the United Nations Declaration of Rights of Indigenous People as a foundation to the Truth and Reconciliation Commission report. So that is also free and available for a lot of folks. And these resources we'll say again towards the end. But in the meantime, we're going to start with some questions about how your industry and how your business can be more inclusive to bringing in not just Indigenous people, but other folks of marginalized communities. And I think I want to recognize Mark for immediately saying his pronouns. This is a conversation that we're also starting to learn. I come from a generation where using pronouns was not normalized for a lot of us. So inclusive employment has been an issue, but also access to the actual business that you do has been some of these barriers. So I'm going to go to our panel again, and now because our slide is not there, I'm probably going to ask Lindsay, then Deborah, and then go to Anne Marie about some questions here, and maybe we'll start here with inclusion and what does inclusion look like to you, and let's start with you, Kimberly.
Thank you. Well, when I think about inclusion, the word include is implicit in that term. And if I'm being idealistic about it, it's a space and a place where people feel safe and there is equitable opportunity for everyone, irregardless of their skin color, their religion, their gender or sexual orientation. That to me is inclusion. When I think of Indigenous inclusion, although inclusion for us is inclusion for everyone, I solemnly believe that. But Indigenous inclusion rather takes on a little bit of a different perspective in that, just as you referenced, there's some histories and some truth telling that we ought to learn as Canadians in order to provide a good context and foundation for the work that we need to do together as we move forward to become more inclusive.
Mm-hmm. All great words. Deborah, would you like to pop in and chime in? What is it like? What are some of the barriers that you've faced, or the what does inclusion look like for you?
Yeah, so I echo absolutely Lindsay's comments there. I think there's, general inclusion in the workplace, which is everything Lindsay spoke to. Indigenous inclusion to me is being able to bring my full self to work. And I know that's kind of a cliche saying, but it means that I don't have to think twice about what I want to freely express. It doesn't mean that I belong, because belonging is assimilation to me from an Indigenous viewpoint. I don't want to have to fit in so that I can belong somewhere that's foreign to me. So to me, it's allowing myself to be my full, proud Nihiau woman in the business workplace.
Oh, that's wonderful. Thank you, Deborah. Anne Marie, would you like to build on what Kimberly and Deb were saying?
I know these ladies following them. What else is there to say? When I think of inclusion, as I think of respect and acceptance. All too often we need to take a walk in the shoes of the marginalized groups that we see, and why. This is something that and to reiterate what Deborah Deborah and Kimberly have said is, this is to be able to come into my workplace, to be able to walk down the street, to be able to not worry about my son. These are things that I continue to, but respect and acceptance. How do we get there? How do we get there as a group here? And part of that is, as leaders, we have the ability to change what maybe normally wouldn't happen. So that's where I see this moving forward.
Mm-hmm. These are great points. I appreciate you all chiming in on this idea of what inclusion is. I think for especially folks across Canada and globally may not understand the anti-Indigenous bias that exists still here in Canada. We have, the Indian Act that still affects us day to day. It's embedded in the Canadian Constitution, so it affects not just our day-to-day realities, but it's literally racist legislation embedded in our Canadian Constitution that guides Canada. So I think that folks who may not understand the anti-Indigenous bias we face and trying to get into these industries or trying to access business services, how difficult it is. So more specifically with that, I wanted to say, how do Indigenous communities view the purchasing, the process of, say, insurance, whether it's health, auto, property? What exposure has your experience been about learning in this industry? And what about career opportunities? Would you even consider joining the insurance industry? So we'll probably go in the same order. So I'll start with you, Kimberly, and ask you some of your thoughts about, just accessing insurance in general, what maybe some of your experiences have been or what your thoughts are, and if you would ever consider working.
So interestingly, I am still a relative new person to the sector, just celebrated 2 years with insurance and risk. And I would say that just generally speaking, I think our industry knows that we have opportunities to expand our reach and the awareness for all people around, whether it's career in particular. I think that when I think about from a First Nations perspective, and I don't want to homogenize us either, because we all come from different lived experiences, whether we grew up on our communities or were urban living First Nations people, our socioeconomic status, all of that has a factor in how we would perceive insurance. But I would say for the vast majority of people, when you think of Canadian First Nations people overall, the level of poverty that exists in our communities would probably say to me, and I can't say this from actual evidence or fact, that insurance and the term risk is likely not well known. I think that, I think of my community, Anishinaabe community in Sandy Bay. There's no way that most people have home insurance. They may have vehicle insurance. The governance systems, the band's chief and council, naturally they would have to carry insurance. But I think it's largely a privileged thing, in my opinion. And so then if we take it from an educational perspective, and then we look at career opportunity, I think we absolutely have the ability to increase the level of awareness around careers. There's incredible careers in the industry, as we know. I think that we have to think about things like access to even technology. We are an enabled sector by technology. And when you think broadband is still something that many communities don't have, my gosh, many communities still don't have drinking water, fresh drinking water. So there's a few barriers that we need to cross together, and that's a way in which that as a sector, as individuals, we can become more active in our allyship, is being able to address those barriers so that we can get to that space and place of educating and creating awareness around opportunity. And I'm sure we're going to talk more about that, and I have some thoughts to share just on how that's possible, but I'm going to defer to my other amazing sisters on the panel.
That sounds great. Thank you so much for that. I look forward to hearing more. Deborah, what are your thoughts about insurance in general? What has your experience been, and would you ever consider working in that industry?
Well, I'm going to share a short little story here. Um, I grew up in a time where, my mother took me and my youngest brother moving all over the country so that we wouldn't end up in residential school like my siblings did, all of my siblings and my mother. So, um, so I wasn't exposed to my culture until, I'd say I was about 12 years old. So I've been on a decolonizing journey since I was a young teenager. And I actually did work for a large insurance organization in Saskatchewan for a little bit of time. And they're the ones that relocated me to Calgary, actually. So at that point in time, I seen nobody that looked like me. And that was quite a while ago in the industry. There was absolutely, no plans or priorities or strategies for Indigenous employment or inclusion back then either. And so that's when the seed was planted for my career and my life's work of ensuring there's a path paved for Indigenous inclusion and employment and retention, not only in, say insurance, but in corporate Canada in general. So I would say that, in my role now, my experience that I've gained and my decolonization process, I've seen great strides, in Canada. I see great gaps and barriers still. There's still a lot of work to do in this space. I think, we've done a lot. And, being a specialist in this field, I don't often hear about the insurance industry specifically through, media channels or social media, etc., about being champions or having good practices developed yet in this space. So I think there's room to grow. I think there's opportunity for the insurance industry to get on board with some of the best practices in the country, and I'm certainly looking forward to that.
Oh, that's great. Thank you so much. I appreciate it. Building off of what Kimberly and Deborah was saying, Anne-Marie, what would you add to that about that, your experiences with insurance, and would you ever consider working in that industry?
It's it's funny, Michelle. I never thought I'd be working in this industry. And so you look at representation within every industry, and risk and finance is very, like, there's very little to no representation. And so what do we do? And I know that last week actually, Deborah, I was in your community, and I'm always actively speaking about coming and working in this industry, and I have account executives across Canada, speaking about working in this industry. But I agree with Deborah. There needs to be more. We need to be, whether it has to be a priority, and how do we measure that? Because it's not. And then even just the basic concept of insurance, we don't, do we even look at our own policies? And very much to what Kimberly was saying, it's here we are. We don't have home ownership. The only experience that we have as individuals on the community is through our vehicles, and so that is it's very. And or if we are an employee of the nation, then we have health benefits to go along with for our non-insured health benefit program. So these are things that the conversation needs to be continuing. I don't think what is happening right now within our industry is sustainable, and we need to be moving forward and looking at solutions in every gamut of this industry.
Well, you brought up, you touched on some really important things that maybe a lot of folks that are listening may not know. The Indian Act doesn't allow us to own property on reserve. And a lot of misconceptions are that Indigenous have free health care. And I think that even for Canadians off reserve, it is not something that you have to have really strong insurance from your companies in order to have so-called free health care, and those barriers exist. And if you're not working full-time at a position here in Calgary or in Canada in general, then of course you're not going to have access to a lot of the health benefits that are available but are denied to a lot of Indigenous people. I wanted to ask you that, and this wasn't a question that we were all kind of prepped with, but I think it's important as we talk about these industries. Um, the role that you play in your workplace, and this is any workplace anywhere, don't you find that you have two roles? You're also a cultural advisor and educator that you're not paid for, and educating constantly on Indigenous issues, and then the actual job that you were hired for. Just wanted to quickly touch on those thoughts with you, Kimberly.
Well, I feel fortunate in that with Gallagher, not only am I the Associate Vice President of People and Culture for the West, but I'm also the lead for Canada, the nation, on our division side, which is the Gallagher Global Brokerage Division for inclusion and diversity. And albeit we're in our early days in Canada of moving that agenda forward, it's part of my role. So as much as I'm always open and willing to support what it is that I can share from my own lived experience and unique perspective, it's nice to be able to have the opportunity to work within more of a structure to bring more awareness to the business case for inclusion and diversity, and also just it's the right thing to do, and our company has a commitment to that. So I feel very lucky. That hasn't always been the case, I'll say that, in my past careers.
Yes, I agree. Thank you for that. Deborah, would you like to elaborate on what it's like being an Indigenous woman in the workplace, and whether you have those two hats that you're kind of forced to wear?
Yes, sure. I've always said I walk in two worlds. I have one high heel and one moccasin, right? And everything that I do, and so all of my positions and throughout my career, that has been the case. And I can only be who I am authentically at spirit, and that's a proud Nihiau Isku. And that's what I bring into the door. And if I can't bring that through the door, then I'm not going to walk through that door. So the workplace has to be open to has to be open and willing to listen to that. So I feel very passionate about the work that I do and the personal things that I advocate for, because it's for our children, it's for our grandchildren, it's for the next generations, right? So the work and the paths that we're paving now are for them. So we have to take risks. Yes, I get paid a salary to do the job that I'm hired to do. But you're right, there's always a component of education and awareness that you bring with you when you disclose that you are an authentic Indigenous person with lived experience and cultural knowledge and traditions. So, I love supporting the Indigenous employee networks wherever I go. I think there's power in the people within that structure. And so I think, sometimes it can be too much though, even me, and I always joke and say that I have thick as alligator skin, because, a lot of stuff just doesn't bother me anymore, but alas, I am, a human. And sometimes I just have to say, I'm going to listen today. I don't have any capacity emotionally or spiritually to do anything else. So, and that's okay, because those times come where you need to be quiet as well. So I think just honoring your own personal values, making sure that you're not being tokenized, making sure that you're being respected and valued as an authentic Indigenous person in the workplace is imperative. I'll just stop there. Thanks.
Oh, that's wonderful. Thank you, Deb. I appreciate that. Anne-Marie, would you like to build off what Kimberly and Deb were saying?
Yeah, I know, it's funny. So when I came to work at Aon, and my former boss has since retired, David Angus, and I marched into his office and I said, if you're going to work in this space, you got to know this space. We're not naive enough to go across the ocean and work in Japan and not understand their culture. And so why do you think that you can do that here in Canada when we have such diversity? And so from that, and he's this little Scottish guy, and he says, okay, sounds good. And so from that, we had, I said, when at home, we open and we close our meetings with prayer. and so we had an elder from your neck of the woods there, Kimberly, and he came in to our segment meeting and he opened our meeting and closed our meeting with prayer. But part of that, and our executive team was sitting there at our segment meeting, he brought, this book, the TRC Calls to Action. He challenged each and every one of us. And my thing is, when we're going on this journey of reconciliation, it is all about education. It's all about learning. And so, here, yes, I am called upon, in responding to this and responding to that and assisting with this. But I think it's so important. It's so important. I have access to all these employees. Why don't I want them to know our history? I want them to know, the intergenerational trauma that's happened to our people, and why, when you see, what you see on the streets today, this is why. So bringing in local elders and leaders to speak to our employees has always been a very important, part of my journey with my colleagues.
Yes, you really brought up a great point. One of the questions is how do we train our friends and or our colleagues, and how do we what are our individual roles impacting? And you just really encapsulated that right there by bringing in those elders and doing that ongoing education as well. So those are great points to start on. So maybe we'll just focus on that question about, are there any organizations that are ahead as a leader on this topic of business reconciliation and inclusion? And maybe I'll start again. We'll go in the same order, Kimberly.
Okay, thank you. Well, when I think about the opportunities to use some really great groundbreaking work that's being done, and I'm sure it's being done in many places outside of Manitoba and Winnipeg, but that's where I'll speak from. I have the great honor of being the incoming co-chair for the Winnipeg Poverty Reduction Council. And I've been a member of the council for some years now, but we've focused work on TRC number 92 and specifically around youth employment. And one of the things that we've done over the last several years is centered on Indigenous people, so centering around what it is and who it is that we're really trying to address with respect to inclusion, but then also looking at it from a very holistic and systemic perspective, realizing that we can't do things the same way, and we can't just expect that if we open our doors as employers and organizations to Indigenous people, that is just simply what we need to do. It's much more complex. We've been talking about all these complexities throughout the presentation. So one of the things that we've done collectively, and when I say collectively, I mean that there's a guiding circle of Indigenous people that have led and guided this work. So that's really an important part to underscore, but have co-created through really what is a social innovation lens, this idea of where and how we envision the future. And really what it does is then moves us along a pathway to looking at barriers, and then once we understand those, starting to eliminate some of those barriers while focusing on the perspective of an Indigenous person, and in this case, youth. So some things that have been successful is creating councils, circles that combine the Indigenous youth and or job seekers with employers, and starting from the beginning, supporting this idea of awareness on the employer side of what it is that they ought to be aware of as they're wanting to engage and include Indigenous people. So going through that first important phase, important part of learning and educating, and then beginning to transform workplaces through what is difficult work, because we're talking about systems level change here, doing the maturity analysis around policies and procedures and processes and systems that may not implicitly bias, but when you begin to look at it through the lens of an Indigenous youth, they're telling us clearly what some of those things are that aren't even recognizable. So all that to say that you need to do that transformative work before then we get to that place where many employers want to get to immediately. There's this imperative to get bums in seats, and then that's the tick in the box of inclusion, where that's really one of the last steps. And then it's sort of a cycle that goes on and on and on. And I would add that this is a model that just not only works for Indigenous inclusion, but one that's good for inclusion and diversity within that broad wheel anyway. So that's one thing that I know that has been successful. We're still in our early phases of beta testing, and the idea around a collective impact model, which this really is that you do small tests and you tinker and you refine, and then eventually you scale it for impact. So I'll look forward to the next time we're around the fire to share some of those successes. But there's been early success, is what I'll say.
Yeah, that sounds great. I'm so happy to hear those initiatives. Deb, would you like to add to that? And again, kind of focusing on the question of, how do we access and train our colleagues, and what do you see as your role as an individual impacting change in your industry?
Okay, so that's a different question, is it not? than what you asked, Lindsay. I was all prepared with my answer to. Anyway,
ask the other one then.
No, that's fine. Just would you please repeat that for me, Michelle?
Sure. Well, there's about 3 questions here. Like, how do we access and train our colleagues? Are there organizations that are ahead as a leader, and kind of your role in your industry with that? So kind of combining those ideas together.
Sure. So again, my career has been in this space. So absolutely learn through trial and error, falling on our face, having great successes. And, overall, the one thing I've learned is you have to have the Indigenous voice at the table, for sure. You have to make sure that your organization does the work before you start dipping in your toes in this pool. You have to make sure you have an inclusive and retentive organization. You have to ensure that you have things to offer that are of value to the Indigenous workforce. So, such as employee networks, as an example. There are many organizations that have done great in this space. There's many that have not. I think the more that you engage the Indigenous voice, however that looks like for your organization, the more successful those programs are going to be. And, I've been doing this for, almost 25-ish years. And, the Moxon Telegraph still exists. It doesn't matter how much technology that we develop or online processes and ways to engage this demographic, that exists. And that also exists for brand and reputation. So everything you do in this space has to be done in a respectful way for it to be successful, because if it's not, and you run the risk of a bad brand because of it, you're hooped. So I think overall, have Indigenous people doing the work is important. Making sure your organization is ready and doing it in an authentic and respectful way.
Oh, it's beautiful. Thank you so much, Deb. I appreciate that. And Anne-Marie, just building on what everybody said, what would you like to add?
I think it's really important, and reiterate some of the comments here, is having that Indigenous voice, whether it's on the board of directors of these organizations and or leadership within Indigenous committees. Here at AON, I've formed an Indigenous committee that has Indigenous and non-Indigenous representation to just move forward with what we want to do here, because we do need changes within our governance and our operations. And something that was really has assisted in our journey and changing that was with the Canadian Council for Aboriginal Business. JP, before he left, and now he's done tremendous things, in the 10 years that to make industry accountable. And I encourage, every industry leader that is on this call, specifically in Canada, but also looking and seeking out those organizations, to assist, because some people don't know how to do this, if they don't have the Indigenous representation. And, furthermore, I look at, when we're looking at our, to Kimberly's with the youth, and how do we actively engage and bring our youth into being a part of this and growing them. So it's it's reaching out to our communities, our education institutions, and working with them and moving that forward.
I'm just going to bring up a social justice idea to a lot of folks out there. One of the highest demographics of youth that are committing suicide are Indigenous. And I think you all touched on bringing youth into business. And, that is such a great way of seeing a role as a person and as an individual, with all the anti-Indigenous bias in the media and the education system. Seeing themselves in business can also help contribute, giving people hope and a future to move forward with. So I'm really glad everybody brought up youth as well. And just because we were talking, it wasn't really a conversation that we had earlier, but I wanted to throw this at you, is that there's September 30th is a really important day. It's a day that actually fulfills one of the calls to action for truth and reconciliation. And the report came out encouraging that we have a national day of truth and reconciliation and on September 30th, and that this will be the first year that we do that. And a lot of folks have worn orange shirts in order to have that discussion. And there's many resources on Orange Shirt Day that was started out in BC from an Indian residential school survivor who wore an orange shirt, and that was taken away from her when she was at that school. And so there's a lot to kind of discuss about this concept of orange shirt and business and reconciliation. And I know we didn't prepare for that question, but I think just in this time, in this moment, 7 days before we have this first anniversary, it might be really important for us to discuss that as we move forward. And I'm just going to ask that whoever isn't speaking, that you mute yourself, because we're getting some feedback. And Kimberly, maybe I'll start with you about the concept of Orange Shirt Day, September 30th, Truth and Reconciliation Day, and business and their role in this conversation.
Well, first of all, I'm really pleased that the government took that call to action and created, at least as a starting point, a federal statutory holiday. I'm going to say that I'm disappointed that they didn't have the courage to create a stat period, end of story, because I think what it's done is it's put businesses in a place where they need to make that decision. And in fairness, there's still a lot of learning and education to occur in order to inform those decisions. And I understand, I work in the private sector and have worked in the private sector in the past too, that a business is a business as well. So I'm not being apologetic for companies that are making the decision to stay open, but I'm also not harshly judging them. But I think what's great, what I'm seeing evidence of, including in my own company, is that even though we've made decision to remain open, that we are providing resources, we are amplifying the voices, we are talking about why September 30th is important, not just for Indigenous peoples. We are all in this country together. And so when, just to kind of piggyback back to this idea of land acknowledging and the foundational concepts around relationships in that land acknowledgement, not only our own relationships with the land and our identity, but the treaties relationships with one another. I know it sounds tangential, but it also steeps into things like the importance of September 30th and why a non-Indigenous Canadian ought to care about it. What's good for First Nations people is good for everybody. And the idea of now punctuating a history that was kept from all of us is a very good reason to observe that day. So my hope is I see evidence just even in my neighborhood where people are hanging their orange shirts on their doorways or they're banding trees with orange flags. There is a lot of attention, and I'll just make one other comment about my teachings have been that it's our children that change, that have the ability to change our culture. Those children's voices are paramount, critical in how it is that we move forward as a society. Those children will have the impact on generations, all of our children. When you think about the recovery of those burial sites and who could ever imagine that we would have graveyards and schoolyards? That's a whole other conversation. But those children spoke. And when you think of raising a level of consciousness in Canadian society, just along with the confluence of all the world events that have happened in this last year or so, I think that it's created a sense of empathy. Who can't relate to the idea of children being buried in schoolyards? Whose heart is not touched by that? And so if that is what ends up being the trigger to this increased level of consciousness and moving beyond benevolence and kindness and acting, then I think it's a great thing. And I look forward to hearing about what the impact of our first annual official Orange Shirt Day is.
Oh, great words. Thank you so much, Kimberly. Deborah, I just wanted to ask you about your thoughts about the National Day of Truth and Reconciliation, and now our first one being just days away, and a campaign of orange shirts, etc.
Yeah, for sure. So I echo everything, just ditto to Lindsay, but to Kimberly. I would say that, so I have a lot of personal feelings on this space. I think it's great that can be ticked off the TRC report. But, if we think of what would be our elders now, the children that are leaving, finally going home. And then we think of all the testimonies that were gathered through the TRC process of those victims and of those survivors. They asked for a national day, period. They didn't say, we want the federal government to give themselves a paid day off work, and we're going to leave the rest up to businesses. That's not what they asked for. So yeah, it is incumbent upon organizations to decide for themselves how they're going to honor that day. I think there's been a lot because I was very heavily involved in my organization in this process as well. And so I'm going to say that it tore my spirit right down to a low minimum, even just doing this work, because it's very important. The children are driving the change that we're going to see. So I think it's important to honor the ask in the intent that it was asked, and I think companies may get caught up on, to replace this stat with that stat, what's it going to cost the company to do, all of those details. If you go back to the origin of the stories and what was the intention, the initial ask, and it's important that all Canadians take the day, because we all share this history in this country. All of our ancestors do, whether we're Indigenous or not. So I think it's vitally historic in nature this year, and I hope that next year we see a lot more organizations stepping up to the plate. I'll just leave it there for now.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Wise words, both Kimberly and Deb, and Anne-Marie. I'd love to hear your thoughts as well. I've loved your contributions to this conversation.
Yeah, thank you, and thank you, Kimberly and Deborah, for your words. They're I reiterate all of them. So when the initial announcement came out of these graves, and I had an outpour from my colleagues, and wanting to learn more, wanting to, how do we support this? How do we move forward? And part of, we've made the decision here that we're going to take this time, and it's all through Turtle Island, not just Canada, to speak to our colleagues. And so we have, and I think that take the day and to Deborah's a little check mark and here you go, and no, that's not what this is about. It is about to sit here together and honor and what has happened, and to our children that we have lost. It is took me a long time to even respond to some of it, because I was so angry as a mother, as a sister, to think that this has happened. And Deborah, you indicated that your mom moved around in hopes of saving you, and so she wouldn't have to lose you. My Magushin did the same thing. She hid my uncle in the bush, because she lost her daughters. And to think of these experiences and what has happened and the atrocities, and it's unthinkable. And I think it is a day that we come together, that we learn, that we pray, that we acknowledge the loss of this entire country within our Indigenous community.
Yeah, I agree. Oh, excellent words to all of the panelists. Thank you for your conversation on that. I think it's really a critical moment for us to be having this panel and having this moment in time and hearing Indigenous perspective on it. I know for myself, when I was angry at the entire world, actually I'm still a little angry, because it really highlighted to me that folks didn't read the TRC summary, because it's literally in the, you can't make a summary any smaller and not see that there are unmarked graves and missing children, and folks really highlighted to me their lack of work on reading the Truth and Reconciliation Commission calls to action, because they were so painfully there. And I'm grateful to hear you all talk about how business has this role, because they do. Business has a role in honoring this day. Not that it's the subject, but Remembrance Day, I think, is a conversation of veterans would like to have about these issues as well. I am seeing a few folks that had to leave, and but saying really positive things about how much they appreciate this conversation, how much they appreciate our knowledge, and really wanted to let our panelists know as we move towards the end here that this is where our folks listening are feeling, and I think these are really important conversations for us to be having as a country, and I'm grateful that we get to hear. So we actually talked about, Kimberly, just going off of what you were saying about poverty reduction and some of the work that you're doing there. Question I'm going to throw at you all is, how can corporations contribute meaningfully to the well-being and the growth of Indigenous communities across the country? And I'll start with you, Kimberly.
I'm going to take myself off mute. I think that's a really big question, and it should be one, and the answer is probably equally as big. But if I were to sort of encapsulate it, I think that the first thing is really educating ourselves. So if companies can provide resources to support that learning journey for individual employees, that's really important. And there's a lot of information to cover. I know that we're going to post some resources, but starting off with something like the United Nations on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, which is in a little booklet. I think we all have one near us. That's available through the National Center of Truth and Reconciliation. It's nominal fees for this. It's just the cost of the book. Has the United Nations declaration behind it, and in front of it is the calls to action. Reading that helps provide the context and the impetus to why we're doing this. There's a similar booklet that has the missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls and two-spirited peoples that has the over 200, I think it's 231 calls for justice. Those 3 documents are a really good starting point. The University of Alberta has free open source education that is phenomenal. I took that course a few years ago, and as a First Nations person, I found it to be so wonderful. It's very superficial, I'll say, based on the history that it's covering, but it hits all the right marks. So that's U of A. You can Google it. It's free. It's 12 weeks. You could take 2 years if you wanted to. You can do it without any credit whatsoever. It's a wonderful way of learning, and you could offer that to your employees as well. I think that the idea of educating and learning and listening. So at Gallagher, one of the things that we're doing within the broader inclusion and diversity work is hosting what we call courageous conversations. And although you can do surveys that are either engagement surveys or specific inclusion and diversity surveys, and you can look at all your quantitative statistics, the value of having conversations with folks that have lived experience is invaluable, because it provides all that color and all that important detail that a statistic or a survey can't provide. So those are just some suggestions in the early days of what employers can do.
Oh, those are great words. Thank you so much, Kimberly. So I'll head over to Deb. I'll just repeat the question. How can corporations contribute meaningfully to the well-being and growth of Indigenous communities across the country?
Yeah, that is a big question. Contribute meaningfully back to the Indigenous communities. So when we say communities, we don't just mean the nations. We mean Indigenous people that make their home on Turtle Island. So well, I'm always a strong believer in listening. Listen to the Indigenous voice. Find out what it is that they need, that they want. What are the needs? Lobby your governments so that they are accountable for what is being asked by the Indigenous communities and the Indigenous people. And then act on it. So, I've seen too much in my experience organizations that say, well, this is what we'd like to do and we think is best, and then take it as an afterthought. It has to be done with Indigenous people. And if you're going to contribute to the well-being, you don't know what the well-being is until you ask. So you have to ask what the needs, the wants, the requests are, and then design whether that's actions or strategies or contributions through your money groups within the organizations, or your donations and nonprofit charities, etc. So again, it's we need to be mindful that there's lots of resources and opportunities out there to learn. Kimberly was sharing some, and we'll share some resources. But it's very important to listen. Listening comes first. I'll stop there.
Yes.
Thanks.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Deborah. And last but certainly not least is Anne-Marie. What are your thoughts on this idea of how corporations contribute meaningfully to the well-being and growth of Indigenous communities across the country?
So I think about the growth of our Indigenous communities, and I've said this to our executive, and I sound like just sitting here repeating myself, but we have to remember we have the fastest and the youngest growing population in Canada. And I continue on saying that our Indigenous communities and our people, they are the emerging economy here in Canada. And so when we're looking about, partnerships, we look at the priorities that have been outlined, and you understand, I've had some recent discussions with not just within internally, but externally with other industry, and on like the priorities and the needs of housing, health priorities, employment. And so what does that look like? And, and I mentioned previously, but building sustainable business model for our Indigenous communities, especially in this industry. And what does that look like? Because right now, you have a very high risk client, and what they're doing is just exchanging dollars for dollars. So right at this moment in time, what does that ownership model look like? Why aren't our nations, investing in this industry? So these are things that I think, like here we are right now, and I have discussions with Treaty 6, 7, and 8, and several communities, and going forward in a reciprocal. That provides, let's keep our money within our communities. So how do we partner with our communities, like true partnership, not just exchanging dollars for dollars. There's so many times when I'm working for my community and, here's a joint venture. That's not sustainable. Like,
Yeah.
let's be real here. Let's hold hands and walk together. Not just I'm going to put a drop in the bucket here and see you later. Like done are those days. Let's have true partnerships.
Oh, the great words. I wanted to bring up the treaties. The treaties said that we need to share the resources equally, and clearly with the imposed poverty by the Indian Act and the lack of revenue sharing that we've experienced over the course of over 150 years, not only have businesses broken that treaty, but there's a real opportunity now to move forward in a better way with reciprocal resource sharing as well. So I just thank every single one of you for your what you've asked. I see in the chat here, people were like, "Will you please share these book titles again?" And yes, we will at the end of the session. That was already predetermined. So thank you for putting that there. And there's just a couple of questions in the chat. So if there's some more out there, I would encourage people to put them in, and we'll just go through one last time with our panelists and just ask, is there something more you would like to leave this audience with? As we had this wonderful discussion, and I thank you all for your words and your thoughts. And we'll start with Kimberly.
Yeah, I've really appreciated the conversation, and it feels like we could have taken 90 days, never mind 90 minutes. I think that there's a few things that I wanted to add to some of the previous discussions we had, and one of them is this, and this is not my, I did not coin this, but there is this real risk around poverty pornography and how it is that First Nations, Indigenous people are perceived, and how there's this real interest in the deficit side of well, and it is a reality. But I also want to say that we have examples of success coast to coast, and we are entrepreneurs, we have businesses. There is an opportunity when you think of active allyship to support those Indigenous companies and entrepreneurs by using your dollars for their products, and there's so many great products out there. There's a definite opportunity to give rise to success, even from a student success perspective, with organizations such as Inspire, which is a national organization that supports education and achievement in youth and those that are attending post-secondary institutions. So I don't want to leave you with the wrong perception, and I don't want to broad brush and add to stereotypes in our community. There's a beauty in the community too. But we're talking about relationships, and we're talking about righting wrongs. And I think if there's anything that I can leave you with is maybe three things. One is that, and I think we've said it over and over again, and if you've attended any other dive-in sessions, this is the message I'm hearing on all of them about active allyship, is that we do need to listen. We do need to learn and educate, try to approach it from an open-mindedness. If we can't begin to understand, I think that we can at least accept, even if we don't understand and maybe we don't even agree. once we're kind of at that point, that's when we need to act, and we need to be able to amplify those voices, particularly Indigenous voices, and do things that support that. We've talked about being politically active with your governments. We're talking about supporting Indigenous businesses. You can donate your time or your money to Indigenous organizations. All of that demonstrates reciprocity in a relationship, and it begins to change the narrative of our country's history.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. Great points. Deb, would you like to build off of what Kimberly said? Are there other things that you want to leave this audience with?
Yeah, I think, in addition is just don't be scared. Don't be afraid to talk and ask. Realize that it's a journey everybody's walking together, hand in hand. So there's a 50-50 participation from both sides, or both, all people. That's required. I've always said, there can be no reconciliation before the truth is acknowledged. So acknowledge the truth. It's a fact. There's no denying it anymore. Let's all acknowledge it. Then we can take some action in reconciliation. So let's go along that journey for the next 150 years in this country. And let's all realize, reconciliation is not a spectator sport. So I'll just leave everybody with that. And hi, so honored to be here today.
No, thank you, Deb. I appreciate all your thoughts. And Anne-Marie, what would you like to add? What are some thoughts and ideas that you'd like to leave this audience with?
I had some technical difficulties there, so my everything went on pause there for a second. But just building off of the amazing words from Kimberly and Deborah, and you know what? Yes, let's walk in this journey together. Let's learn the truths, because we can't move forward without knowing what the truth is. And when I say walk a mile in the shoes of our people, of the marginalized, that is so important. And it's not just the right thing to do, it's the smart thing to do. And it is the key to all of our growth and moving forward. So with that, Ishnish, thank you, everyone.
Oh, that's wonderful. Thank you. So we did have a couple of questions, and I thought I would just throw them out at our panel as well before we wrap things up. And Alicia asks, around the theme of allyship, can you share examples of non-Indigenous colleagues and what they can do, share, learn to make business environments more inclusive? And I'll just start by saying the land acknowledgement that we began with, these are, I think that you can't even start talking about truth without a land acknowledgement. So whether it's in your email, whether it's something that you say out loud, I do a 2-hour seminar on teaching land acknowledgement because folks still don't quite understand this concept. And I know if I go into an organization, panel discussion, any type of place, and there is no land acknowledgement, I don't feel safe. I know that this is a colonial, you must white code business atmosphere that I'm not allowed to be my authentic self in. So I'm going to start there, but obviously the entire panel has so much to say about what non-Indigenous colleagues can do to make a business environment more inclusive. So I'll start with Kimberly, and then we'll go from there. Maybe we'll go to Deb for now, and we'll go back to Kimberly when she has an opportunity to come back with us. I think we're having a glitch.
Okay, so the question was
I'm
around
back,
the...
sorry.
The question is, and I see the screen just moved. It was about what non-Indigenous people can do to make an inclusive atmosphere for Indigenous people.
Well, absolutely. It always comes back to the education, awareness, and just having those honest and open conversations. with your colleagues in a respectful way. I've always said, I'd rather you ask a question that you think is going to offend me rather than not ask it at all or assume something that's inaccurate. So, be brave, be courageous to have those open, hard to have conversations. Take it upon yourself to do your own research and your own learning in this space as well. So, don't rely on being informed every step of the way, because you have your own accountability as well to take some action in this space. So that's what I would say.
Fabulous, thank you. Again, Alicia asking the question around the theme of allyship. Can you share examples of non-Indigenous colleagues, what they can do to make a business environment more inclusive? And Kimberly, I was wondering if you can chime in.
Totally echoing Deborah's comments about educating. I think that what comes to mind, just as a quote from a great author, writer, Richard Wegemies, is that nothing grows from the outside in. So I really do think that it starts with you and I as individuals, and that we should be educating and seeking that out on our own as much as possible. When it comes to finding folks in...
Oh, and we just had a little bit of a cutoff there. Sorry about that, Kimberly. Maybe Anne-Marie, if you want to just chime in about the theme of allyship and what we can do to share examples that non-Indigenous colleagues can do to make the business environment more inclusive.
For sure, Michelle, and thank you. And I think I'm going to have to reach out to you to do this 2-hour seminar for my colleagues here, because that, land acknowledgement is so important in understanding, within our own traditional territories. But what I can echo again and reiterate what Deborah said is education, 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 education. I think Kimberly mentioned the U of A. They have a free online course for us, and so it takes nothing. It's just some of your time and your willingness and your heart to move forward and wanting to continue down this journey with us.
Mm-hmm. That's great. Kimberly, do we have you back? Okay, thank you so much for that. All right, and so actually somebody did put the link in the comments about the course that everyone's been talking about from Edmonton at the U of A, and it's important. Dan Levy, actually, Eugene Levy's son, has been going on and on about it as well, so that's really given it a lot of pressure, or I guess highlight for folks to know this, how important this is. To our panelists, we're getting so many positive comments, question or things like, thank you so much for sharing. What is good for Indigenous people is good for everyone. So true. Love that. I advise finance and risk students. There's a lot of opportunities available, but they don't self-identify. Any suggestions on how to better support them? And I can tell you, as an Indigenous person, I try not to identify at first until I test the waters and see what kind of comments there are. Being in Calgary, if I hear, build that pipe over the voices of Indigenous people, I know that person doesn't understand sovereignty and doesn't mind making money over my body, my rights, and my land. So, honestly, if you really learn about Indigenous people and learn about the language you're using around us, that creates that positive atmosphere for Indigenous people to feel comfortable even coming out as Indigenous people. And, so I'll just move it on to our panel and ask them if maybe we'll start with Deb, and, what have you seen that has created a better atmosphere for all?
Yeah, so the question around the self-disclosure, right? So that's a big one, and there's so much work that you need to do before you even get to that stage. To your point, are you creating a brand? Is your company known to be a safe place, to be a truly authentic, inclusive organization where people are not afraid or worried about letting you know that they're Indigenous when they apply to your organization. So there's a lot of work, so much details I could go into here, but there's a lot of work, there's a lot of considerations need to put in place before then. So it's not just a matter of having your self-ID form with the wording on it on why you collect it and blah, blah, blah. You have to have established your organization as the go-to place so that Indigenous people are saying, yep, I know this, and I know this, and yeah, I'm going to self-identify.
Yep. Thank you so much, Deb. Anne-Marie.
Understanding, again, our history and understanding that it was very shameful to self-identify as an Indigenous person. Part of what I would suggest is building the trust, building that safe place, because that it is something that so desperately needs to happen, across every industry and institution, is building that trust.
That's all. Awesome. Oh, I thank you all. And it looks like we still haven't got Kimberly, but that's all right. She added so much to this conversation, as did each and every one of our panelists. I'm so grateful for that. I know that a lot of you have been excited about the resources, so maybe we'll go to that slide now. And I'll just kind of quickly go over some of these resources. So grab your pen and paper, and we'll get the slides up that we're going to be working on. So the calls for action. Now, my screen is super tiny, so I can't quite see it, but I'm going to assume it's the Truth and Reconciliation Commission calls to action. And these are, there's 94 of them. They are in the Truth and Reconciliation Commission report. You can get the tiny summaries, and you've seen a few of those summaries that some of our panelists did show, and they're free and available online, and I highly recommend grabbing them, and hopefully your company can facilitate that. I run a book club, and that book club, we actually talk about those 94 calls to action in the sections, and it has taken us a long time to go through them, but to really unpack them and to see the status of where they're at through Yellowhead Institute. The next slide that we have up is the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. Some of us call it UNDRIP. If you hear me, I'll do the acronym of UNDRIP. Oh, that's great. Thank you so much in the back. I can see it really well. This is free again, and this was a lot of work. One of our elders, Doreen Spence, here in Mohkinstsis, a Cree elder, she was one of the contributors to that, as was one of the commissioners for the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. There's so many people who put a lot of work into this globally at the United Nations. So, and it's the foundation to truth and reconciliation. In there is a huge section on economy. So as this conversation is really focused on business, reconciliation, and moving forward, that section on economy is something that I strongly recommend folks look into. Next. There they are, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission calls to action. Those, this is kind of the symbology that we've used, so I think I kind of went over this one already. So maybe we'll go to the next slide. All right, so the University of Alberta, pardon me, is one of those courses that are free, available. I think you pay $60 to get a certificate at the end to say you took it. So it's a wonderful resource for all. The Indigenous Peoples Atlas of Canada, fabulous resource, especially if you're interested in learning more about land acknowledgements. The AFN It's Our Time Toolkit. So this is more ideas of what you can do as an individual to create that safer space and to learn more and take on, as a Canadian, that education that unfortunately our education system failed you on. And then orangeshirtday.org is the nonprofit that really became this new symbol. A lot of us who have had family members of Indian residential schools, orange shirts is our new kind of symbology of this, and I think that the story alone is worth your entire day of September 30th to learn about. I would also encourage anybody to go to local initiatives that are led by Indigenous people. We actually have quite a few just in Calgary alone, and I'm sure nationally. Because of COVID-19 restrictions, there are many online as well, if that is an issue to you, or if you just want to, sit in your pajamas have that conversation in that way. That's perfectly acceptable. So I thank you for these resources and the Ally March. I actually don't know much about that one, so I would have to look into that one. But how to be an ally, if you were to Google how to be an ally to Indigenous people, there's so many wonderful resources, and I highly recommend it. Indigenous People of Canada, socialstudies.org, great ideas to put together. 150 acts PDF. Oh, this is I remember seeing that, and this is a great example where every single Canadian has to see their role in reconciliation. And here's some things that you can challenge yourself on, because it's more than just government. It's sports clubs, it's your community association, it's your and all the things that you do outside of work as well as within work. These are the things that you can do, and it's all laid out by amazing Indigenous leaders that have done this work. Is there any more slides for us? And with that, whose line? Oh yes, who land is it? So there's some wonderful books out there. I really highly recommend everybody does read the Indian Act. The treaties, learn the treaty that you're on, learn that treaty, and you'll be absolutely horrified, I'm sure, by it. There's a book called 21 Things You May Not Know About the Indian Act. I highly recommend reading that, maybe as a base and as a standpoint. And we'll go with the next slide. Murray Sinclair on reconciliation. So many articles. There's the three commissioners, and Murray Sinclair is one of them. He was a former justice minister, or former justice, which means that he was one of the top Supreme Court judges, as well as senator. He was a senator. So, he's contributed to Canada in the most positive way possible, and he has many thoughts and opinions I encourage you to read in. Local resources. There's some important dates coming up, not just September 30th, but October 4th. October 4th is our Sisters in Spirit Vigils, where we acknowledge the missing and murdered Indigenous women, girls, and Two-Spirit. There are calls to justice for all businesses in that report for the National Inquiry, which I encourage all folks to partake in. And just start following your local Indigenous artists, your local Indigenous businesses, because they are the ones leading these wonderful initiatives on September 30th, October 4th, etc. And and with that, I'll pass it back over to Mark. I guess before I do that, a huge thank you to my panel. I can't tell you as your sister to you what it's like to share some of these experiences, thoughts, and your knowledge of what it's like to walk this world, as Deb said, with one in each world, one with a high heel, one with a moccasin. And I can't thank you all enough for your generosity in this conversation. So with that, I will give it over to Mark. And Mark, thank you for letting me host this wonderful conversation.
Well, thank you very much, Michelle, and Kimberly, Anne-Marie, Deborah. This has been really powerful to listen to you. Humbling. I think we, as settlers, should be very humble, and the lessons are very clear. Listen, ask, educate, I think are some pretty powerful concepts and actions. And the other part of this is, like Deborah, your term reconciliation, nothing will happen without action. So thank you all very much. Thanks again to the sponsors. And there's an email address for those who may have missed any of those. My co-event leader, Angie Milialgo, and I really apologize for butchering your last name, Angie, but you can contact her by email, and she will help to find the resources that have been mentioned. As well, this PowerPoint presentation will be posted, so you can get the links there through that as well. So thank you very, very much.